Hi, welcome to the Unit 2 lecture notes. In these notes, we'll cover Chapter 3, questions and their uses, and Chapter 4, structuring the interview. So let's start off by talking about open questions and closed questions. So in open questions, you have a lot of latitude. Respondents especially have a lot of latitude to determine how much and what type of information they're going to tell you. In highly open questions, there are virtually no restrictions on the interviewee to answer a specific way. These questions are typically phrased beginning with words such as the ones I have listed below: why, what, how, explain, and tell me about, etc. Anything that's not restrictive. For example, a highly open question might be, tell me about your vacation to Montana last summer. Now you see how that's highly open because there are a lot of places to see in Montana, and of course it has 4 geographic areas like any other state, so I didn't narrow it down to anything. I just said, tell me about your trip. Well, that could be a very long answer, right? So we can narrow it down a little bit with moderately open questions. They're a little bit more restrictive, but they still give respondents a lot of freedom in how they answer. And a moderately open question about Montana might sound like, tell me about your vacation in Montana in Glacier National Park. So you see how I'm narrowing it down a little bit from just broadly Montana to Glacier National Park. There are some advantages and disadvantages to each type of question that we write for an interview. For open questions, an advantage is that it encourages your interviewees or your respondents to talk. And I'm going to use interviewee and respondent interchangeably in these notes because they really are the same thing. Another advantage of an open question is that interviewees can determine the type and amount of information that they want to disclose. I know a lot of times when I've used open interview questions that I'll get the answer to my question, but then I'll get even more information that I didn't ask for, which is always interesting. Disadvantages, they really take up a lot of time. Open questions take up a lot of time. And then respondents may give irrelevant information, or on the other hand, they may withhold important information. Closed questions, the opposite of open questions. They're very narrowly focused, and they restrict the respondent's freedom to give more detailed answers. So moderately closed questions, they ask for very specific, limited pieces of information. So for example, what was your favorite part of Glacier National Park? Very specific. A highly closed question, they're very restrictive and they ask respondents for one piece of information. So for example, when were you in Glacier National Park? So of course, obviously that would have to be a month and a year. There's no other answer for that. And then bipolar questions limit respondents to 2 polar answers or 2 polar choices. Sometimes they ask for an evaluation or an attitude, or just sometimes they ask for 2 opposites. So for example, are you a conservative or a liberal? Do you like or dislike dark chocolate? These are bipolar questions. There's only one answer that they can choose from. Some advantages and disadvantages of closed questions. Advantages, obviously, the interviewer can control the length of answers, and guide the respondents to answer specifically, to provide specific information. Closed questions require very little effort from either party, and they take less time. And then brief short answers are easy to record. Disadvantages, well, obviously, if you're limiting your respondent, then you're going to get very little information back from them. So that requires that you ask additional follow-up questions when maybe one open question would have done the job. Another disadvantage is that interviewers talk more than interviewees, and they completely control the flow of the interview. So we've looked at closed and open questions. Let's look at primary and probing questions. So primary questions simply introduce topics or new areas in your interview, and they can stand alone even when they're taken out of context. So, for example, this one's from your book on page 37. Tell me about your experiences when hiking the Appalachian Trail. So you could ask that no matter where you were in the interview. A probing question is an attempt to discover or elicit additional information from your respondent, and they only make sense when they're connected to the previous question or a series of questions. So, for example, tell me about your experiences when hiking the Appalachian Trail. So maybe your respondent starts to tell you, and then they say, this part of the trail was my favorite. A probing follow-up question might be, why was that part of your trail the most favorite? You see how that's a follow-up probing question. It follows up the primary question and it asks for additional information. Because in an interview, you don't want to be so inflexible that you can't follow your interviewee if they introduce a new subtopic or topic. You want to be flexible and follow up. And if you feel like you need to ask another question, then by all means do it. Let's see. We need to talk about probing questions. I guess we'll get to that slide in a minute. We also have neutral questions, and we have leading questions, and I'm going to focus on loaded questions. So with a neutral question, it really allows your interviewee to decide upon their answer without direction or pressure from the questioner. In a neutral question, I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute. So let's just go through these definitions and then we'll look at some examples. A leading question, they definitely direct interviewees to specific answers. Interview bias is woven into leading questions. We'll look a little bit more at that in a minute. And then loaded questions. That's an extreme form of a leading question. It's an obvious question that dictates an obvious answer. So we'll look at some examples of that. So here we have neutral and leading questions. So you have an open or a closed question here. So a neutral question, primary. How do you feel about the new core requirements? And then you see the follow-up question, why? Remember, it's one of those words that I've used with open questions. Why do you feel that way? A closed question, which is also bipolar. Do you approve or disapprove of the new core requirements? A follow-up, is your approval moderate or strong? These are restrictive questions right here, the closed questions. A leading question, you see how it's phrased? There's some kind of value judgment that's always included in a leading question. So there's some kind of value word here. Most top students favor the new core requirements. How do you feel about them? Well, as a respondent, you might be thinking, oh, well, if the top students favor the new core requirements, then I should too. So you've got these value words, top students, favor. That's what makes them leading questions. A closed question: do you favor the new core requirements like most top students I've talked to? You're putting pressure on the respondent to answer a certain way when you ask a leading question. So here we are, the type of probing questions. These are important, and of course, as I said, probing questions are always paired with primary questions. So a silent probe, that's simply remaining silent as a way to encourage your interviewee to continue. So let's say, for example, you ask an open question, they answer it in detail, they pause, and you can tell they're pausing. Then as a probe, you just remain silent. That is a hard skill to learn, I will tell you that. It takes some practice, not to jump in there and try and fill the gap in the conversation. But I have learned through interviewing that if you are silent and you wait, then the interviewee will usually continue. Another type of probing or way to probe is nudging. So you're using short phrases here to encourage the interviewee to continue. So maybe they give you the answer, they pause, and you could say, "Oh, I see. Yes, that sounds interesting." Or, go on, I'm listening. And then they'll pick up where they paused and they'll start again. This is a very effective strategy too. Let's look at reflective real quick before we look at clearinghouse. But you definitely want to use a reflective probe when it's necessary to clarify that you heard the information as the respondent intended it for it to be heard. So you're just asking for verification that you heard what you heard. So you restate the information. Clearinghouse, I always use this at the end of my interviews, and that's part of the interview script this is one of the probes that we're going to use in our interviews. This encourages the interviewee to fill in gaps of information for questions that you may have not asked. And we'll look at that, I think here in a few slides. We'll look at how to use a clearinghouse probe in the closing of your interview. Now you can it's not really the place to use it in the body of your interview, it's always at the end, but you can definitely use silent, nudging, and reflective probes as you're doing your interview, as you're asking your questions. So we've talked about different types of questions and what they are and what kind of information they elicit. Let's look at common question pitfalls, because we're all subject to these when we write a question or we ask follow-up questions. And the more you interview people, the more that you get more skilled at avoiding these kind of questions. So we have bipolar questions, an unintentional bipolar question, where you're asking a question that only will give you a yes or no answer, or just two choices. And like I said, it's unintentional, so it's not calculated. A yes or no question, an obvious question that elicits an obvious answer. A double barrel question, I see these a lot. These are questions that has two topics instead of one. So let's see. I was trying to think of an example of one. Let's see. The double barrel question. Okay, so here's one on page 44 of your book. Which colleges do you support financially? So that's one question. And why did you choose these? That's a completely different question. So you see you're asking two questions in one. It's always easiest and simpler for everyone in the interview if you ask one question at a time. An intentional leading question, a question that's phrased to influence an answer, and then in turn, interviewees try to give the interviewer the answer they think you want to hear. So it may be, let's see, I saw a really good example of one. Quitting your job in the middle of a recession was stupid, wasn't it? Well, I mean, what are you going to say? Yes, because it's an awkward question and it puts the interviewee on the spot. So these are pitfalls, and as you write your questions and you send your drafts to me, I'm going to be looking at them also for pitfalls. And if I find one, then I'll send it back to you and ask you what kind it is, and we'll draft your questions so that they're solid. All right, that's the end of question 4. And again, I just pulled out some of the examples in chapter 3 for these notes, so you'll want to go back and read chapter 3 in more detail. But I'm just pulling out the salient points. So chapter 4, we're going to talk about how you structure an interview. So we're definitely going to use an interview guide as we interview. You're going to have a piece of paper in front of you that is, I just call it a script, but it's an interview guide. It's carefully crafted and carefully laid out so that you can make the most out of your informational interviews. An interview guide is carefully structured outline of topics and subtopics that you're going to cover during the interview. So I look at an interview guide as a list of questions, even though your book says it's not. It really is your list of questions. It ensures that you're covering all your important topics, and it helps you in recording answers and recalling information when the interview's over. There are several kinds of interview guides, but the one we're probably going to use, or the two we're probably going to use most, are topical and time. Well, you might use the space also as well. These are informational type setups, whereas cause to effect and problem solution are more persuasive. We're not going to conduct a persuasive interview. So focus on topical, time, and space. Okay, so topical, it follows the natural divisions of a topic or an issue. For example, you might be interviewing someone about your major or your career path, and so you would ask questions such as, what kind of experience do I need? What kind of internship should I get? So it's like subtopics under your main topic. A time interview guide sequence is that it arranges topics in chronological order. And then a space sequence, it arranges topics according to spatial divisions. So like north or south, or maybe if you think about campus and the way campus is laid out, or maybe, let's see, neighborhoods. So it arranges topics based on spatial or geographical divisions. So we have a few different types of interview schedules, and a non-scheduled interview is just that. It's very, very brief. There's no questions prepared in advance. You just kind of have an idea of what you're going to do. You have to be a pretty skilled interviewer to use one of these. The kind that we're going to use is the moderately scheduled interview, and it contains all of your major questions with possible probing questions under each. So, for example, if you write an open question that starts with, tell me about Montana, then you might have you would jot down a possible probing question or a follow-up question to that. And the probing question would depend on what the interviewee reveals. A moderately scheduled interview allows you the freedom to probe answers and adapt. And that is the thing I like the most about a moderately scheduled interview. It allows you to adapt. It's easier to conduct as well. A highly scheduled interview, questions are worded very exactly, and you're looking for very specific information. So with a highly scheduled interview, there's less flexibility and there's less chance to adapt to circumstances. They provide a lot of precision and reliability, and they're easy to replicate. You can combine these different types of schedule, but I would just, like I said, we're going to use a moderately scheduled interview. And then the highly scheduled, it's not that much different from the highly scheduled is continued here on the notes. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. So as you can see, there's no straying from the schedule. It's very, very straightforward, very planned, and very structured. All right, let's look at question sequences, and I've just picked out a couple here. There's many in your book, starting on page 54. I picked out the tunnel sequence and the funnel sequence, so they rhyme there. The tunnel sequence, it works well with really simple or informal interviews, and it's just a string of open or closed questions. So you would probably be using a topical interview pattern for this. It's designed, tunnel sequence is designed to get information about attitudes, reactions, intentions. I can't talk, sorry guys. Funnel sequence. This is the one we'll probably use the most in our interviews. But what you're going to do is begin with really broad, open-ended questions, and then you're going to narrow your questions a little bit as you go. But you're going to ask open questions so that you can get your interviewees to open up and respond to you, and so that you can really establish rapport with them. And then you narrow it down as you go along. And as I said, there are other types of question sequences in your book, but these are the two we're going to focus on. All right, so let's get to the heart of it, and let's talk about opening the interview, conducting the interview, and closing the interview. So when opening the interview, it's a two-step process. First, you're going to establish rapport. You're going to create and sustain goodwill and trust between you and the person you're interviewing. Very important in an interview to maintain the trust and the goodwill. The goodwill that you have their best interests at heart and that they can trust you with the information that they're giving you. You're also going to orient the other party or the person you're interviewing about the purpose of the interview, an estimated length of how long it will take to conduct the interview, why you're doing the interview, and how the information will be used. Very important. You want to be as transparent as possible when you're conducting an interview. So some ways to open the interview. Of course, you'll introduce yourself, you'll state the purpose of your interview, you'll establish that rapport, you'll orient them. There's several different ways to open the interview. And these are all pretty much tied up in the orientation, stating the purpose, requesting assistance. You can refer to the interviewee's position on an issue, identify your organization, etc. These are all together. Now, the only time when you'd want to offer an incentive or reward is when you're having a hard time getting people to interview. And one time I conducted a focus group at a high school, and I really thought I would have a hard time getting high school students to respond. So I offered $10 Starbucks cards, and I had more people than I could interview. That worked very well. Okay, so we talked about verbal, about how we're going to establish rapport and orient, but also wrapped up in those verbal openings is your nonverbal communication. There's space. How much space is between you and the interviewer? There's appearance. How are you dressed? How does your voice sound to that other person? How are you coming across non-verbally to that person? And touch. You might want to shake their hand before you sit down. That's usually what I do. And then closing the interview. Very important that you take your time and be tactful about what you do and say in the closing. And it takes both people to make closing successful, because remember, all interviews are dialogues, not monologues. There are some ways or some guidelines for closings. So if you're, coming down to the end of the interview, don't introduce new topics or ideas, because then that confuses people. It's like if you've ever been on the phone with somebody and you think you're wrapping up the phone call and then they suddenly start talking about something new. It's confusing because you're thinking, I thought we were getting off the phone, but you're not. That's called a false closing. So do use a clearinghouse question. Do you remember those back in the probes? Use a clearinghouse question. So what I usually say is, I've gotten to my last question, the interviewees answered it, I'll say, those are all the questions I have for you. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Do you have any questions for me? And then that opens it up completely for the interviewee to add something that they thought about adding before, but maybe now they have the courage to add to the interview. Maybe they have a question for you. So that leaves it very open. And of course, be very patient during this part. You can also say that, we've concluded our interview. Definitely tell your interviewee that you appreciate them taking their time and giving you the information that you ask for. If you want to arrange a follow-up, you can arrange a follow-up phone call to verify information, or you can summarize a few points of the interview. But always use a clearinghouse question and thank them for their time. Usually at this point, if it's face-to-face, which is what you guys will be doing, I stand up to signal that I'm getting ready to go. And that helps them know for sure that the interview's over.